wine arrives first, followed by the meal. Roasted boar, honey-glazed dates, trays of oysters still glistening. You sit 3 cushions from Rome's emperor. Your wife rests beside you. Your daughter, barely 16, fidgets nervously across the table. The chamber fills with senators, generals, their families. Everyone of consequence in the empire is present. Then Caligula rises. He offers no toast. He makes no announcement. He circles the table slowly, passing consuls, prefects, men who command legions. He pauses behind your daughter. His hand rests on her shoulder. He speaks 5 words to you, not to her. The room does not gasp. No one stirs, for everyone present has already learned what you now understand. In this palace, objection equals permission to die. So you do what every father here has done. You smile, you nod, you watch her depart with him. And when she returns an hour later, silent, pale, adjusting her dress, you pour more wine and pretend you saw nothing. Because Rome has just taught you, the empire cares not what you witnessed. It cares what you are willing to forget. If this is the history omitted from classrooms, the documented truth they hoped you would never discover, then subscribe now, because we continue uncovering these narratives one by one. No softening, just unvarnished reality. What transpired in these chambers rarely appears in standard histories, yet the records survive. If you remain because silence should not obliterate documented truth, stay. We returned inside. In 37 AD, when Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus assumed power, Rome did not crown an outsider. They crowned a legacy. His father, Germanicus, had been Rome's most beloved general. Crowds mourned at his funeral. Riots erupted when rumors spread that Tiberius poisoned him. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, descended directly from Augustus. She accompanied Germanicus on campaigns, standing among soldiers in Germania while pregnant. Their children embodied everything Rome told itself it still represented: discipline, nobility, martial tradition, divine lineage. When Tiberius finally perished, the Senate did not deliberate. They offered the purple to Gaius. Caligula, little boots, from the miniature legionary sandals he wore as a child among the troops. He was 24. Rome exploded in celebration. Political prisoners were freed. Gladiatorial games were funded. Granaries opened. Taxes reduced. Suetonius records that over 160,000 animals were sacrificed in the first 3 months alone. For 7 months it felt as though the dark years under Tiberius had ended. Then Caligula collapsed. October 37 AD. The emperor fell into fever so severe that priests were sent to every temple. Senators pledged their lives to the gods if he recovered. One, Atenius Secundus, vowed to fight as a gladiator if the emperor survived. Philo of Alexandria notes the entire empire held its breath. Grain shipments halted, markets closed, messengers rode day and night between Rome and provinces with updates. For days he hovered between consciousness and death. And when he awoke, the records fracture here. Suetonius, Cassius Dio, Philo, Seneca, all note the change, yet none explain it. Some claim brain fever, others suggest poisoning. Modern historians speculate epilepsy, encephalitis, hypothyroidism. But diagnosis is irrelevant. What matters is the man who opened his eyes was not the one who closed them. Within weeks, he declared himself a living god and demanded temples in his image. He forced senators to run beside his chariot for miles in their togas. He ordered a floating bridge across the Bay of Baiae, over 2 miles long, simply to ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate. The construction consumed ships needed for grain transport. He revived treason courts, the same courts that destroyed his family. And he began reshaping palace banquets. At first, Rome interpreted these as eccentricities, youthful excess, arrogance of sudden power. But within months, the pattern clarified. This was not instability. This was method. Banquets were not optional. Senators received word. The emperor requests your attendance. Bring your wife. Bring your daughters if they are of age. Refusal was not listed as an option because refusal needed no prohibition. Everyone remembered what befell families who disrespected Tiberius, so they came. The palace dining halls stretched over 300 feet. Couches lined the walls, arranged by rank. Slaves moved among them with wine, fruit, delicacies imported from Egypt and Gaul. Caligula reclined at the head, and he watched. Not the food, not the entertainment, he watched the women. Ancient sources describe what became routine. He would study a senator's wife across the room openly while her husband sat 3 couches away. Sometimes he commented loudly, comparing her to others, critiquing her appearance, praising features in language designed to humiliate the man, not flatter the woman. Sometimes he gestured. A servant approached, a quiet word. The woman rose because she had no choice and followed. The room continued eating. Conversation resumed. No one acknowledged what had occurred because acknowledgement meant choice, object and vanish, or remain silent and survive. Rome chose survival every time. Suetonius writes plainly, he lived in habitual incest with all his sisters, and at large banquets he placed each of them in turn below him, while his wife reclined above. But the sisters were not the only targets. Seneca, writing decades later, describes how Caligula publicly evaluated the wife of a consul, Lolia Paulina, then removed her from the room. When she returned, the consul did not react. Cassius Dio records, he summoned the wives of men to the palace as if to honor them. Then, after examining them as though they were slaves for sale, he took whichever one he pleased. Sometimes he sent for husbands as well and forced them to witness. The phrase "as if to honor them" is crucial because the summons arrived with pretense, a gift, a compliment, an imperial favor. Refusal was framed not as self-defense but as insult to the emperor. And insult to the emperor carried one penalty. Dio continues, afterwards he would return to the banquet and openly discuss what had occurred, offering praise or criticism while the husbands were present. This was not secrecy, this was exhibition. The palace kept records, secretaries documented attendance, names were logged, who came, who brought whom, who left early and why. Pliny the Elder mentions these records existed for decades, stored in imperial archives until destroyed under the Flavians. But while they existed, they served a purpose. They turned every banquet into documentation. Attendance became complicity, and complicity became insurance for the emperor. Because men who participated, who watched, who stayed silent could not later claim ignorance. They were witnesses, and witnesses to imperial crimes became accomplices, meaning they could never testify. Some men were rewarded afterward, land, titles, positions. Others were mocked, fined, exiled for failing to appreciate the honor. The randomness was structural. If punishment followed resistance, men could unite in refusal. But if punishment was arbitrary, if cooperation might bring reward or nothing, then every man acted alone, isolated, silent. Survival became individual, and collective resistance became impossible. Seneca describes the calculation. Men who once commanded armies now measured their words at dinner, fearing even agreement might be interpreted as conspiracy. In 39 AD, after uncovering a plot led by Gaetulicus, Cornelius Lentulus Gaetulicus, Caligula did not merely execute the conspirators, he targeted their families. Their wives were summoned to banquets. Their daughters were evaluated publicly. Then, weeks later, after humiliation had settled, the men were formally charged with treason. By then, resistance was already broken. The accusation was merely documentation. Yet Caligula also promoted one of the conspirators' cousins, granting him a command in Germania. The message was clear. Loyalty to family could destroy you. Loyalty to the emperor could save you. Choose. Dio records that some senators, anticipating the pattern, sent their wives to the countryside, claiming illness or family obligation. Caligula responded by requiring proof, medical inspections, sworn testimony. If the women did not appear, husbands were fined or stripped of rank for disrespecting imperial hospitality. One senator, name lost to history, tried a different approach. He brought his wife to the banquet, but seated her between two older matrons, hoping visibility would provide protection. Caligula noticed. He commended the senator publicly, praised his devotion, then summoned all three women. When they returned, the senator was assigned to inspect grain stores in Sardinia, a post that meant exile. His wife remained in Rome. The system was explicit. Your family attends, or your career ends. And once they attended, they belonged to the palace. Yet some women did not wait to be summoned. Lolia Paulina, mentioned earlier, did not resist when called. Her family had paid fortunes for imperial favor before. She understood the trade. Seneca notes she arrived wearing emeralds worth 40 million sesterces, not as protest, as advertisement. Because in Caligula's palace, being chosen could be framed to the outside world as political success. Families began including these imperial audiences in marriage negotiations. A daughter who had attended the emperor's private chambers could be marketed as having imperial favor. The humiliation was rebranded, and Rome's elite were willing to rebrand it because the alternative was admitting they had no power left at all. Yet violence alone does not explain compliance. Caligula understood that fear exhausts, that people adapt, that even terror becomes routine. So he alternated punishment with reward. After a senator's wife was publicly taken, the senator might be promoted. After a daughter was removed from a banquet, the father might receive a lucrative grain contract. Philo of Alexandria describes watching this in person during his diplomatic visit to Rome. Men of consular rank stood outside the emperor's chambers, waiting, some in dread, some in hope. When their women emerged, they did not weep. They negotiated. The palace became a market. Access to the emperor required offering what he wanted. And what he wanted was submission demonstrated. Some families sent gifts in advance: gold, slaves, estates in Campania. Others volunteered their daughters before being asked. The economy of the empire began reflecting this. Senators borrowed heavily to afford gifts that might win favor. Moneylenders in the forum charged higher interest to families known to be in imperial disfavor. Entire fortunes were liquidated to pay for a single audience. And when those fortunes ran out, Caligula had a solution. He auctioned the property of men he executed, then invited the families of the executed to bid. If they refused to bid, they were accused of disrespecting the emperor's generosity. If they bid, they purchased back their own stolen property at inflated prices. The treasury swelled, and Rome stayed silent.
They wanted forgetfulness. When news reached the Senate, they did not mourn. They debated restoring the Republic. For hours, arguments filled the chamber. Some senators called for elections. Others proposed a council of consuls rotating power. It felt for a moment like possibility. But the Senate had no army. The Praetorian Guard did, and the Praetorians were not interested in debate. They found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, hiding behind a curtain in the palace. The man Rome had dismissed as a fool for years, stammering, limping, ignored at family dinners. The Praetorians declared him emperor, not because they loved him, because he promised to pay them 15,000 sesterces per soldier, the largest donative in Roman history. At that point, the Senate voted to confirm Claudius the same day. The Republic was never mentioned again. Chaerea expected execution. He had killed an emperor. He had violated his oath as Praetorian, but Claudius hesitated. Chaerea was popular among the troops. Executing him risked mutiny. For weeks, Chaerea remained in custody, neither charged nor released. Then whispers started. If Chaerea was not punished, what message did that send? That killing emperors was acceptable. Claudius finally ordered the execution. Chaerea was beheaded. Cornelius Sabinus followed. The other conspirators, those whose names survived, were exiled or quietly removed from the record. Rome moved on. The records do not say what happened to the women. Lalia Paulina survived. She remarried. Years later, Claudius's wife, Agrippina, accused her of witchcraft. She was exiled, then forced to commit suicide. Other women simply vanished from documentation. Daughters brought to banquets stopped appearing in family genealogies. Wives mentioned in earlier inscriptions disappear from later ones. Some historians suggest suicide. Others suggest quiet exile. Some propose they were simply written out, removed from memory the way Rome removed Caligula statues. Because Rome did not want a reckoning. It wanted forgetfulness. Caligula's name was erased from monuments. His decrees annulled. Claudius declared him damnatio memoriae, condemned to oblivion. Not to honor the victims, to erase the question of complicity. If Caligula was insane, then Rome did not fail. It was simply cursed with temporary madness. And madness, unlike cowardice, cannot be blamed. The women who survived were given gifts, land, money, compensation for silence, and they took it. Because what choice remained? Their testimony would have required Rome to admit what it spent centuries pretending did not matter. So they accepted the gold, remarried, and disappeared into history. Caligula ruled for 3 years and 10 months. In that time, he did not invent imperial abuse. Tiberius had committed atrocities on Capri for a decade before him. Suetonius describes how Tiberius forced young boys and girls into sexual acts, sometimes throwing them off cliffs afterward. How he kept nobles imprisoned in his villa, torturing them while pretending they were honored guests. Augustus himself had exiled his own daughter Julia for adultery, though many believed it was political revenge disguised as morality. After Caligula, the pattern continued. Claudius, who Rome thought would restore order, was later accused of murdering his wife Messalina after she humiliated him publicly. Nero kicked his pregnant wife Poppaea to death, then married a boy named Sporus after having him castrated. He forced Sporus to dress as Poppaea and appear in public as his wife. He also hosted banquets where senators' wives were assaulted while their husbands watched, calling it entertainment. Commodus fought as a gladiator and sold positions in the Senate to the highest bidder.
Elagabalus forced Vestal virgins, priestesses sworn to chastity, into marriages, then divorced them weeks later. He paraded through Rome in women's clothing while assaulting senators' wives at state functions. Caligula murdered his own brother Geta in their mother's arms, then ordered the deaths of 20,000 of Geta's supporters, including their families. The list continues for centuries, so the question is not why Caligula did what he did. The question is why Rome acted like it was temporary. After Caligula's death, the Senate debated restoring the Republic for 6 hours. Then they confirmed Claudius and went home, because the Senate had lost its power decades earlier, not suddenly, but gradually. Under Augustus, the Senate still appointed governors and controlled finances. Under Tiberius, the Senate still debated laws. Under Caligula, the Senate attended banquets and clapped when told. The shift was not dramatic, it was procedural. Augustus had given the praetorians permanent status and a salary funded by the imperial treasury, not the Senate. Tiberius had moved treason trials from public courts to private imperial hearings. Caligula simply made explicit what had been implicit. The Senate governed because the emperor allowed it, and that permission could be revoked. When Claudius took power, he did not restore Senate authority. He thanked them for their confirmation, as if their vote had mattered. Then he governed exactly as Caligula had, minus the theatrical cruelty. The structure remained, only the performance changed, and Rome, exhausted, called it reform. Suetonius, writing 70 years after Caligula's death, included the details about the banquets, but he framed them as examples of insanity, proof that Caligula was uniquely deranged, not that the system allowed it. Cassius Dio, writing 150 years later, documented the wives who were summoned, but he wrote in Greek for an audience far from Rome. His accounts were histories, not accusations. Seneca, who lived through Caligula's reign, mentioned Lolia Paulina's emeralds but did not mention what she wore them for. The sources exist, but they exist as fragments, as anecdotes embedded in larger narratives about imperial excess, never as investigations into why hundreds of men with wealth, power, and military command waited for someone else to act. Never as testimony from the women who survived, because asking those questions would have required Rome to confront what it spent centuries denying, that the system had been designed to make resistance impossible, and that silence was not cowardice, it was architecture. We know Lolia Paulina's name because she remarried an emperor. We know Caesonia's name because she died with Caligula. We know Julia Livilla, one of Caligula's sisters, because she was later exiled for alleged adultery. But the others, the daughters brought to banquets at 16, the wives summoned while their husbands watched, the women who attended month after month, year after year, knowing what attendance meant. Their names exist only as gaps, inscriptions that mention wife of, without listing her name, genealogies that skip a generation, marriage contracts that end abruptly. Some historians have tried to reconstruct these lives from financial records, a dowry paid, then returned, a property transfer with no explanation, a will that disinherits a daughter for reasons known to the family. But reconstruction is not testimony, and without testimony, what remains is structure, the palace, the banquets, the system, and the men who built it. Caligula's assassination did not save Rome. It taught Rome that spectacle could be tolerated as long as it eventually ended, that humiliation could be endured as long as status remained, that women could be erased as long as lineage continued. The palace did not close after Caligula. It remained the center of power. The banquets continued under Claudius, Nero, and the emperors who followed. What changed was not the system, What changed was that Rome learned to call it statecraft instead of madness, and the women who survived were never asked what they learned, because their testimony would have required Rome to admit what it spent centuries pretending did not matter, that the empire's power rested not on law or honor or military strength, but on who it taught to stay silent and how. The records exist. The sources are documented. The names are still there, or they are not. Both absences tell the same story. If history like this matters, stay with us. Mythic Chronicles of Old does not let silence win.